I'm sure I'm not alone when it comes to being rule followers. We all know those people, or maybe you're like me and you are one of those people that just has a hard time breaking the rules, right? And if you are a rule breaker, you get annoyed when people break them. Rules are there for a reason. And when someone breaks a rule, they're being irresponsible. That comes from the book of Lynn, just so you know. This is kind of where the Pharisees were with Jesus. If you read back through the New Testament, they were just constantly up in his stuff, right? Shaking their fingers at him saying, you can't do, you can't do, you can't do. But he could do, and he did do. And as word spread through the people of the things Jesus did, they reached the ears of Bartimaeus. Now let's look at the story of Bartimaeus again. If you want to follow along, we're in Mark 10, and we're going to start with verse 46. Then they came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man named Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and he came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Now there's a lot in that passage, so let's break it down just a little bit. Jesus, his disciples, and no telling however many other people are with him, are in Jericho now. And as they head out of the city, a blind man hears this crowd coming. And something, maybe he hears it, maybe he feels it, but he picks up on Jesus is close by. And the next minute, without caring who is around, without caring who hears him, throwing caution to the wind, but with every bit of belief of what Jesus can do, Bartimaeus shouts out, Jesus, have mercy on me! And what happens next? Do you remember? They told him to be quiet, right? They're probably saying, would you stop yelling? You're a blind man. You're diseased. You're not clean. You have nothing. You have to beg for everything you need. Don't embarrass yourself and don't embarrass us. But Bartimaeus didn't care because he was a rule breaker. Jesus came back and said, what do you want me to do? And Bart simply said, I want to see. He didn't have to convince Jesus or tell a long story about how or why he was blind. He just believed that Jesus could heal him. And of course, Jesus did. Because having faith means there is believing before blessings. Bartimaeus was willing to break the rules to get to the blessing. He was a rule breaker. Again and again in Scripture, we find people just like Bartimaeus, people living the message from Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is being sure of what we do not see. People believing God is who he says he is, and he is worth every rule that they need to break to get to him. Think of the woman with the bleeding problem who risked everything just to touch his robe. Think of Noah, who, according to Scripture, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. And then think of the mother of Moses, who, going against the king's decree, put her baby in a basket and floated him right down a river. All rule breakers, and they needed to be. Now think about Jesus. Jesus broke the Sabbath rules, Jesus touched lepers. Jesus hung out and ate with Gentiles and sinners and prostitutes. Also a rule breaker. Why? Because Jesus knew what they needed. He knew what Bartimaeus needed, just like Jesus knows what we need. And a really super cool, amazing thing about Jesus is he knows it before we can sometimes find the words to say it. When we're lost and looking, when we're searching for the right words, when we're frustrated and don't know why, when we're just kind of stuck, right? Do y'all remember when you first learned to ride a bike? Your first two-wheeler? There you are, training wheels off, hands on the handlebars, and your feet are on the pedals, and you slowly begin to pedal, and even though you feel wobbly, your dad's right there holding the seat to keep you balanced, and then you're off, and you're pedaling along, and you're thinking, I'm doing it, and then you realize no one's holding the seat anymore, and that's when usually what happens? A crash, right? That's what happened to my sister. When she first tried riding without training wheels, she and my dad were in the front yard, and off she went. Dad ran along a few steps behind her, and then he let go of that banana seat, and for a few glorious minutes, she was riding all on her own, and she rode right into the boxwoods in the front of the house. She went in so deep into those boxwoods that she was stuck. The limbs were like up to here, up to her waist, and so stiff that she was just sitting there, perfectly straight, couldn't move. That's the kind of stuck I was talking about. Have you ever felt stuck like that? When you can't go forward, but you can't go backwards either? When I was in cancer treatment, it was like that a lot of days. Because my body was fighting so hard and it was taking such a toll. I wish I could say that these were the times that I lifted my eyes to Jesus and I gained all my strength from him. But honestly, it can be just the opposite sometimes. Sometimes we have a tendency to pull in instead of reaching out. Maybe we don't have the energy, or maybe we don't have the concentration to be able to read the Bible or have a quiet time or write in your journal. Have you ever been just so exhausted that you can't even find the words to pray? We're just stuck. As my sister sat on her bike in the boxwoods, trapped by all those limbs, my dad walked down and he grabbed the back of the seat and he just pulled the bike right out. She never called for help because she knew someone would help her. She slipped out as easily as she rode in, and she just needed someone to do it for her. She didn't know what to do, so she just waited. Our faith tells us even when we don't call out for the Lord to help, he sees us anyway. He sends just the right people to rescue us, someone to pull us out of the boxwoods, because in faith, there's believing before blessings. In the heart of the story of Bartimaeus, he's a man who had a deep, deep belief in Jesus even before he received his blessing. This is a really powerful reminder for us because often we find ourselves just waiting for a sign, just waiting for a miracle, some kind of confirmation before we fully commit our faith to God. If the third car that comes down the road is blue, Lord, I'll know you're giving me a sign. If I see a message on Facebook from this person, I'll know you're giving me a sign. If the cheese melts all the way to the corners on my toast, I know you're giving me a sign. Right? We just want that confirmation. We want to see the evidence first. Bartimaeus was a blind beggar. He had no status, no wealth, no influence. He had nothing to offer Jesus, but he had faith. He believed in Jesus' power to heal him. He believed in Jesus' compassion to help him. He believed in Jesus' love for him. His faith was not based on what he could see or touch or prove. His faith was based on what he knew in his heart to be true. And this can be such a challenge for us because we live in a world that values evidence, proof, and logic. We want to see before we believe. But faith calls us to believe before we see. Faith calls us to trust in God's promises even when we can't imagine them being fulfilled. Faith calls us to believe in God's love even when we can't feel it. And faith calls us to believe in God's power even when we can't see it. Believing before blessings. By the time Jesus had crossed paths with Bartimaeus, he had been doing ministry for a while. And in spite of his asking people to not tell what he did for them, word had spread, and Bartimaeus was confident in what Jesus had been doing and would do for him as well. It was worth being a rule breaker. Think back to the very early days of Jesus' ministry. Simon and Andrew and James and John had finished their work for the day and were probably putting everything away on their boats for the next day of fishing when Jesus came to them and said what? Yeah, follow me. Can you imagine the courage it took to put that life away and trust everything to this man that maybe they did or didn't even know that well? Can you imagine going home and saying, honey, quit my job today to follow this guy. Don't really know who he is, but I just kind of felt like I needed to. They knew it was important. They knew it was important enough to be a rule breaker. And that's what it's like to follow Jesus. To follow him so closely that we're tripping over him. To take everything and just put it aside. All the great things, all the hard things, all the happy things, and all the sad things. Taking it all and surrendering it to him and saying, Lord, I can't, but you can. I can't, but you can. It's holding our faith tightly in our hands and believing what the Lord will do when we bring the blessings, because that's who God is. He's worth being a rule breaker for. Let's go back now to the end of my airplane story. It's now been like an hour on the plane. I opened the window shade and I got to watch the sun begin to set in the clouds. The flight attendant passed me a Diet Coke, and I realized just how sweet Jesus is. He reminded me that life gets complicated and a little scary sometimes. He's louder than Anxiety Girl. He never, ever rolls his eyes at me. He saves just the right seat for me. And that day, he made sure I didn't miss the sun begin to set. Lessons learned that day? We can trust Jesus knows what we need. He's bigger than any eye-rolling TSA agent. And don't forget your purse when you fly. Would y'all pray with me?